Art. Terrific. Thank you. Uh, Hello and welcome. We have over 100, just exactly 100 screens right now, and we had 150 and 100 and just shy of 150 the last two. I suspect we will approach those numbers in a couple of minutes. So we've had wonderful attendance. Welcome to all. We will be recording this. I believe the recording was started. Recordings will be made available in accordance with WES policies. I dropped my email address into the chat. So if you need to contact me for the recording, let me know. So please welcome everyone to West End's third part of the four-part educational series on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict presented by esteemed Rabbi Maurice Harris, a Reconstructionist rabbi, and the Israel Affairs Specialist of Reconstructed Judaism. And by the way, we've had two already, and they have been wonderful. Welcome. The program is presented by West End Synagogue, co-sponsored by its Israel Connections Committee and its Adult Education Committee. It's a four-part series being presented on 4 consecutive Tuesdays in January. So this is the third out of the fourth, and the fourth one will be Tuesday, January 30th at 7 p.m. So please mark your calendars. You're welcome to attend any or all four. And we welcome visitors from many other congregations, including SAJ, Congregation Beit Am Shalom, and I also just met someone from the Reconstructionist Synagogue on Long Island, whose name I've forgotten. But welcome to all. Let me introduce you to Rabbi Maurice Harris, and perhaps we can pin Rabbi Maurice. Thank you so much. He is a child of Moroccan Israeli Jewish mother and an Ashkenazi Midwestern American Jewish father who spent most of his childhood summers among his family in working class Moroccan neighborhoods in Tel Aviv. In 2003, Maurice received rabbinic ordination from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, after which he served as associate rabbi at Temple Beth Israel in Eugene, Oregon until 2011. For the past 7.5 years, Rabbi Maurice has worked as Associate Director for Thriving Communities and as Israel Affairs Specialist at Reconstructing Judaism. Rabbi Maurice is also author of several books, which he may have a chance to tell you about later. Let me briefly describe this course. It provided a 4-part comprehensive overview of the major components of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, admittedly a challenging subject. To do so, Rabbi Harris has used a dual narrative approach, alternating between a classical Jewish Zionist narrative and a classical Palestinian narrative. Presenting the perspectives side by side, the course describes and attempts to humanize and understand both in a way that honors the depth, humanity, and complexity of the people involved in the conflict. And I will say from experience that hearing the dual narratives has really been a beautiful dialectic and an eye-opening way to experience and understand the issues involved. Although the course presents both narratives, Rabbi Harris approaches the subject from his own progressive Zionist perspective, while urging people to seek out and explore other points of view. As a reminder, the views and analysis presented are entirely Rabbi Harris's and do not speak officially for either West End Synagogue or for Reconstructing Judaism as an organization. The lecture should take about 1.25 hours to 1.5 hours. We have run a little long, but we will do our best. To keep things flowing smoothly, Rabbi Harris will take questions at the end. And we will close the chat because there's been just a lot of chatter in the chat that some people found distracting. We're going to close the chat very shortly. I'm going to let Rabbi Maurice just speak for a moment so that we have a sound check and make sure we can hear him clearly. And then we will close the chat, but we will open it about 15 minutes before the end. So that's the time to save your questions, write them down, send them either to me directly or to the chat generally. And thank you all. Let's begin.
It's good to be with this group again, and I just so appreciate the willingness of this many people across several Reconstructionist communities to actually to dive in and to take the risk of engaging a dual narrative approach and I also, not just the risk, but also to be open to the rewards of that approach. I am hoping that my sound is coming through decently. I know there've been occasional glitches with, I think, with my Wi-Fi service. I've tried to fix that, but I can't swear it's going to work. So I guess if everyone freezes or I freeze, we'll know that something glitched, but we'll come right back.
So far, you sound loud and clear, so we will close the chat. Thank you.
Okay. Uh, I want to also acknowledge that we continue to be doing this course together during a time that is really hard, with a lot of um, worry, anguish, and uncertainty in the Jewish community, and also a great deal of internal conflict across parts of the Jewish community that has sometimes been painful within families or among friends and colleagues. Um, and my hope is that uh, that the worst of it will be short-lived. But I want to just name that those are unusual circumstances for us to be gathering. And I also tried to trim the presentational part a little bit, so I'm hoping that works. So I should probably dive in. And I'll just say where we left off at the end of last time was we just made it through a Zionist or Jewish narrative of the Six-Day War in 1967. So I backed up about one slide's worth, and I'm going to share my screen and go into slideshow. And there we go. So I believe this was the last slide we might have been looking at, and we'll dive in here, closing out a Jewish narrative. The impact of the Six-Day War was intoxicating, euphoric, and confidence building, not just for Israelis, but for Jews all around the world. Uh, the Israelis quickly shipped captured Soviet military equipment to the United States as a gesture they hoped would lead to a much closer relationship, opening the door for what would soon become the United States' heavy military and economic investment in Israel. That hadn't really begun as of 1967, but it soon would. The victory also appeared to put Israel's government in the driver's seat regarding the potential for trading newly captured land in exchange for diplomatic recognition, peace, and security in the region. It also set the stage for the now half-century-long Israeli military occupation of the West Bank and the occupation of Gaza, which extended all the way until 2005, and then followed by the walling off and blockade of Gaza. And of course, there is another narrative about 1967. So we're going to pivot, and I remind everyone about the risk of neck injury from whiplash, toggling between one narrative and the other. And this is another one of those hard pivots. The Palestinian narrative of this same period of time says very much the opposite of the Israeli narrative. It's a narrative that says that the Israelis started the war with a surprise air attack on Egypt's parked jet fighter planes, and that this was part of a grander strategy to expand Israeli territorial holdings. One of the reasons why this seems very logical in a Palestinian narrative is because the Israelis had, going backwards in time a few years, in 1956, joined forces with the French and the British in an attack attempting to seize the Suez Canal from Egypt by force. That was an attack that failed and resulted in an Egyptian military triumph, by the way, but which exposed the Israeli desire to conquer and control more Arab land. That's how it read to Palestinians. Israel's willingness to join forces with former European colonial powers proved to many Palestinians the argument that Israel was the tip of the spear of ongoing Western domination of the region. For most people in the Arab world, as a matter of fact, the June 1967 war was seen as an act of naked aggression and conquest by Israel, revealing Israel's true colors as a Western colonial outpost trying to expand its reach. Those beliefs were strengthened by Israel's decision to begin building new settlements in the West Bank and Gaza very shortly after the end of the war. And Israel began to build these settlements in the West Bank, in Gaza, and even in the Sinai Desert. And this was a flagrant violation of international law. So as we've seen before, these two narratives disagree on crucial facts, and also they disagree on who is the righteous victim and who is the cruel aggressor. The War of 1967 is known as Al-Naqsa, the Great Setback to Palestinians. During the course of the war, somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 more Palestinians fled or were expelled or were otherwise uprooted from their homes. And many more villages ended up getting razed. Refugee camps in neighboring Arab states swelled. They already had large numbers of people in them, and now they were bursting. Almost as soon as the dust from the war had settled, as I mentioned, Israel began authorizing new settlements in the captured territories, beginning an expansion that has continued to this day. The refugee population grew, as did the number of refugee camps. A new situation arose in which Israel now controlled a major Palestinian population living under its military rule, including refugee camps in the occupied territories that dated back to the Nakba in 1948, as well as towns and villages throughout these lands. For Palestinians, the losses of 1967 were an extension of the losses and dispossessions they faced in 1948. Their goals remained largely the same: to win back the right to their lands and homes throughout Palestine, even as the other state actors in the region, like Egypt and Syria, pursued agendas that sometimes aligned with the Palestinian cause and sometimes did not. The post-67 arrival of hundreds of thousands of new Palestinian refugees destabilized neighboring countries, some of whom already had big internal challenges. Lebanon, for example, which was established as a parliamentary democracy in 1943, based on an agreement that guaranteed specific leadership roles and numbers of seats in parliament based on the proportions of the population that were Christian, Sunni, and Shiite. Lebanon at the time had a population of around 2 million when the first arrivals of large numbers of Palestinian refugees showed up. From a Palestinian perspective, Zionism's effects were disastrous for their own fortunes, but also detrimental to the challenges facing neighboring Arab states, whose maps had been drawn by Europeans in the first place. In any event, the military failure of the coalition of Arab armies that fought Israel in 1967 led many Palestinian activists to conclude that they could not rely on other Arab forces to win them back their homes and lands. And organizations like the PLO rose to greater prominence with a formidable base of power and paramilitary training camps in Jordan. So you see, we backtracked a little bit. So here's where part 3 officially starts. But don't worry, I shaved some material so that hopefully tonight we run a little shorter than before. This time, I want to say, I am going to be spending longer than I have previously setting the stage for the dual narrative part of the presentation. So there are a lot of complex historical events to cover in order for the two narratives to make sense. So let's get started with that. We'll move forward. Last time, and this is a teeny bit of review, we left off in the immediate aftermath of 1967, and as you can see, Israel conquered new territory in 4 separate areas. Its total landmass tripled after the war, and there was strategic and symbolic importance to the territories that were now under Israeli rule. Israel's capture of the Sinai put Israeli forces right up on one side of the Suez Canal, which was one of Egypt's most important strategic assets and a nationally beloved symbol of Egypt having thrown off the yoke of European colonial domination. The Golan Heights, which had provided Syria with the literal high ground in their border with Israel, also had provided Syria with an important geographic buffer between Israeli troops and its capital, Damascus. Now, Israeli troops were stationed atop the heights, able to surveil Syrian activity with only 45 miles separating them from Damascus. And of course, Israel took over the West Bank, previously ruled by Jordan, and Gaza, previously ruled by Egypt. At the time Israel took over the West Bank and Gaza, there were 1.3 million Palestinians living there, several hundred thousand of whom were living in refugee camps established there after 1948. If you're wondering, the state of Israel's population at that time was about 2.8 million. A radically new situation faced the government of Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, one born of a military victory that happened within the blink of an eye. In addition to now militarily occupying lands populated by over 1 million Palestinians, Eshkol's government suddenly had captured the eastern half of Jerusalem, including the Old City and its holy sites. Israel was 19 years old and suddenly looked like the dominant regional power that it would in fact become over the next half century. 1967 really was a huge pivot point in the history of both the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. So let's start out this session with a brief turn to one of the metaphors we've been leaning on throughout this course, the one in which I claim that the Israeli narrative tends to take a bird's eye view of history and the Palestinian narrative tends to take a ground level view. In the Jewish narrative, winning the Six-Day War and taking over the old city of Jerusalem set right a centuries-old historical injustice. Look at this map, where the purple countries, or really, I should say, the dark blue countries, are Christian-dominated societies, and the green ones are Muslim-dominated societies. Now, if you squint really, really hard, you can spot the little bit of blue that represents Israel, the only Jewish-dominated country on the map. Jews were finally getting a little bit of what the other Abrahamic regions enjoyed. Jews were finally getting a little bit of what the other Abrahamic religions, Christianity and Islam, enjoyed in abundance, namely sovereignty and homeland. But the 1967 war also placed Judaism's holiest site back under Jewish rule, and that seemed more than fair to most Jews as well. After all, Christianity has multiple holy sites, but if we take, for example, the most famous of these sites, the Vatican, we can see how magnificent and vast it is. Hundreds of thousands of people can fill St. Peter's Square, and the stroll through the halls of the Vatican is a marvel of art and architecture. Similarly, the holiest site in Islam, the Kaaba in Mecca, is stunning in architecture, in grandeur, and in magnificence. The destination point for holy pilgrimage for Muslims from all over the world, it can host between 750,000 and 2 million worshipers at once. After 1967, the Jewish people, originators of the religion that is the parent to both Christianity and Islam, finally had control of their holiest site, the Kotel HaMa'aravi, the Western Wall, a modest ruin of part of the retaining wall of the ancient temple complex that the Romans had destroyed nearly 2,000 years ago. For centuries under foreign rule, Jews would visit the wall and weep in lamentation over the destroyed temple and of their fate of exile. And so the site also became known as the Wailing Wall. Compared to the holiest sites of Islam and Christianity, the Western Wall is tiny, modest, and shares its simple spotlight with the much more opulent and grand Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque, which comprise Islam's third holiest site. To begrudge the Jewish people sovereignty over this modest site feels to many Jews like the height of spiritual greediness. Those who already have so much and who owe so much to Judaism spiritually for their own existence, insisting that it is unjust and impossible for Jews to rule over a 488-meter-long ancient remnant of their destroyed temple. So that's a bird's eye view look. So you might want to take a breath, because now we're going to whipsaw around to a Palestinian narrative and a ground level view of what happened when Israel conquered the old city of Jerusalem and the Western Wall in 1967. And again, the invitation here is to try to make space to just hear and hold these two narratives side by side. So for Palestinians, especially residents of the old city of Jerusalem, Jewish descriptions of world history and balancing out the power relations between the three great monotheistic religions, all of that seems bizarrely removed from their lived experience. The conflict for them is not some geopolitical game of risk. Rather, it is a series of conquests and decisions made by Zionist leaders about their homes, their lives. If someone could see who's unmuted, we can get rid of that echo, or we can mute everyone and I can unmute myself. We good? I think we're good.
You're muted, Rabbi.
Thank you. But we did it. We got there. Okay. So what I was saying was that in this ground level view, this Palestinian narrative view, talking about the old city and 1967 and the war and what happened in terms of geopolitics and which great religion gets what doesn't really resonate for them. What resonates for them is immediate decisions made by the Israelis in the aftermath of the war that affected their homes, their lives, and their freedoms. And again, running theme for Palestinians without their consultation or consent. So let me explain. What you're looking at here is an old pre-1967 photo of the Western Wall. And the yellow rectangle on the screen is there to point out, in case it hasn't already jumped out at you, that there was a neighborhood of Palestinian Arab homes that went almost all the way up to the wall before the Israelis took over. In this photo, you can see what it was like just before June of 1967 to visit the Western Wall, what the tourists visiting the Western Wall had to do. And you can see it's nothing like it is today now. In fact, the walls of the homes that were closest to the wall were pretty close to the wall itself. There was this narrow area where people filed in. Here's one more view of that neighborhood. So what did the Israelis do after capturing the old city? Within 1 week, the government ordered bulldozers to destroy these homes and clear out space for the plaza that Jews around the world love to visit. For Palestinians, the Jews' miracle of celebrating B'nai Mitzvahs at the wall is yet another painful episode of a series of thefts and humiliating dispossessions. Just think about that. I mean, every time I've been to Israel as an adult, I end up going to the wall. I pray there. I'm moved to be there. There's usually B'nai Mitzvahs that are happening and all this celebration. And East Jerusalem residents, Palestinian residents, see all of that happening, and they know that it's all happening in this space where this entire neighborhood was knocked down without the homeowner's consent. And it hits these two groups of people completely differently. When Israelis go on TV and talk about Israel as the Middle East's only democracy, for Palestinians, the thought is, but for who? Who has privilege in this democracy? Who counts and who doesn't? To underscore how strong the grip of these two narratives are on their respective audiences, consider this. Probably very few Palestinians have been taught that Jews deserve some say over the final status of their holiest site in the world. What they have been taught are about the bulldozers that destroyed a Palestinian neighborhood and evicted several hundred residents. And I would bet that very few Jews have ever seen the pictures of the neighborhood or know about the bulldozers that cleared it away quickly before anyone could do anything about it. With that, let's cover a little more general history of the years that would follow, and then make our way back into alternating between the two narratives. The 67 war was a disaster for Egypt's President Nasser. It burst the aura that he had, where he had projected as the compelling and inspiring figurehead for the entire cause of Arab nationalism and unity. The heads of state of the Arab League met after the war in Khartoum to assess and regroup. They issued a declaration that became known as the 3 No's of Khartoum: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. Specifically, the pledge was that Arab governments would unite to use diplomatic, economic, and military pressure to bring about an Israeli withdrawal from all territories captured in 1967. And that until that goal had been accomplished, they would not talk to, acknowledge, or end the state of war with Israel. Nasser was convinced that only military force would get Israel to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula, or at least compel the international community to force Israel's withdrawal. Now, keep in mind now that the Israelis occupied the Sinai, they were stationed along one side of the Suez Canal. In the spring of 1969, Nasser formally announced a new military campaign against Israeli forces in the Sinai, a war of attrition, as he called it, and so began a year and a half of much fiercer fighting between the two sides that would leave 1,500 Israelis and 10,000 Egyptians dead. I'll give you a little moment to read some of the bullet points on the screen before going to the next slide. Meanwhile, recall that after the 1948 war, several 100,000 Palestinians were expelled or fled into Jordan, where they populated several large refugee camps. By 1969, the head of the PLO, founded by the Arab League 5 years earlier, was Yasser Arafat, who oversaw an organization that was part guerrilla army, part the umbrella organization for multiple separate armed Palestinian factions with different ideologies and views about tactics, and part international diplomatic representative of the Palestinian people. The PLO was headquartered in Jordan. And remember, Jordan was a British-created monarchy ruled by ethnic Hashemite Arabs who had once been the lords or sharifs of Mecca and Medina in what would eventually become Saudi Arabia. The Hashemite kings had been promised independence for all of the Arab world by the British and the French, going all the way back to World War I. You might remember we covered all of this. Ultimately, the British arranged for the two leading brothers of the Hashemite family, who really should have been ruling Mecca and Medina, the key cities in Saudi Arabia. The British farmed them out, one to rule a new country they made up called Jordan, and the other to rule a new country they made up called Iraq. They literally made these countries up and drew their borders according to British interests. Now, the brother who took over Iraq as king was eventually overthrown by an officer's coup, which would one day give the world Saddam Hussein. The other Hashemite brother, ended up becoming the king of the newly created country of Jordan, and his grandson, pictured here, would rule as Jordan's King Hussein from 1952 until his death in 1999. As Egypt pressed its military clashes with Israel to try to get them out of the captured Sinai territory, the PLO continued strengthening its military units as new waves of Palestinian refugees who fled parts of the West Bank during the fighting of '67 arrived and grew the refugee camps in Jordan. Jordan's leaders, meanwhile, tried to walk a tightrope. On the one hand, they tried to stay aligned with Egypt's Nasser and the PLO, and they tried to be their allies in their goals of using military force and international pressure to get Israel to give up newly conquered territory. But on the other hand, Jordan's leaders were worried that the PLO was turning into its own mini-state within Jordan, possibly becoming capable of toppling their regime and taking it over. Things were heading towards a boiling point, and the USSR and United States were entangled in it, and they were at growing risk of ending up in direct confrontations, which they both preferred to avoid. In 1970, President Nixon's Secretary of State, William Rogers, initiated several diplomatic efforts to try to get Israel and Egypt to de-escalate. One of his ceasefire plans was accepted by Nasser, also by Prime Minister Golda Meir and by Jordan's King Hussein, and it was implemented. Although technicalities were included in the agreement that allowed Nasser to claim that he had not violated the 3 no's of Khartoum, remember that? The PLO, and in particular, several of the more radical factions involved in the PLO, felt betrayed by Egypt, and their hostility towards Jordan's rulers grew. There were then multiple assassination attempts on King Hussein of Jordan, and Jordan and Egypt both took steps to curtail the influence of the PLO in their respective countries. And these events helped set the stage for what would become several recurring patterns over the 1970s and 80s. Over the next 2 decades, Israel built new settlements throughout all the territories it had taken control of after the '67 war. The government used economic incentives to lure Jewish citizens to move to modern apartments in the Sinai Desert, the Golan Heights, in Gaza, and in the West Bank. Most of the settlers came for the generously subsidized housing, but a growing bloc of Orthodox Jewish followers of a Messianist strand of Orthodoxy that viewed the Israeli victory in '67 as a divine sign that required Jews to reclaim all of biblical Israel flocked to the settlements. Israel's secularly dominated leaders found these passionate Jewish believers to be useful to their short-term goals, which were to create more Jewish facts on the ground and set up a situation in which Israel would either one day annex these new territories or have a stronger hand to play in negotiating a favorable permanent peace agreement with the Arabs. Meanwhile, the Palestinian population in exile grew. In the refugee camps scattered across Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, and Lebanon, as well as in countries across the Gulf region and even in North America, the Palestinian survivors of the great exoduses of '48 and '67 grew into the millions. And although there were many disagreements among Palestinians about politics and strategies for advocacy, during this time, the PLO solidified its international standing as the most recognized and institutionalized government in exile of the Palestinian people. This was true not just within the Arab world and in the communist bloc, but it became increasingly so in the halls of the United Nations and European capitals as well. And so, throughout the '70s and '80s, Israel and the PLO fought an ongoing asymmetrical war against each other, sometimes in the streets of Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank, sometimes in foreign capitals through assassinations and acts of sabotage and terror, and sometimes through support for governments or radical groups whose interests may only have temporarily aligned with their own. That war included a pattern of Israel using its world-class army and air force to decimate the headquarters and infrastructure of the PLO in other countries, including Lebanon. Which brings us to one of the most tragic aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Lebanon, which had established its independence from the French in 1943, was established as a parliamentary democracy with a carefully negotiated informal constitution that guaranteed something like proportional demographic representation for the small country's multiple ethnic and religious groups. Contrary to the old adage that Israel brought democracy to the Middle East, Lebanon was founded as a democracy, albeit a fragile one that was highly vulnerable to the possibility of civil war. After 1948, when a couple 100,000 Palestinian refugees fled to Lebanon, the country's delicately balanced demographic power-sharing arrangements were strained. The country fluctuated between periods of civil war and stability, right up until 1975, when it fell into what would be a 15-year-long civil war. The PLO was headquartered there after having been chased out of Jordan, and before too long, the Israelis began invading Lebanon to fight the PLO there. The 70s and the 80s were also the heyday of guerrilla, militant, terrorist, or freedom-fighting revolutionary groups, depending on your point of view, generally aligned with the Soviet Union against Western-backed governments and institutions. Airline hijackings became so frequent in the 1970s that the airport in Havana, Cuba, actually set up a government department to manage the regular arrivals of Western airliners that would often be diverted to Cuba, where they would sit on the tarmac as various demands of ransom or prisoner releases were negotiated with Western governments. Organizations like the IRA in Northern Ireland, the Japanese Red Army, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the Baader-Meinhof Group assisted each other in carrying out assassinations, bombings, mass shootings, sabotage, often paying close attention to how their actions would come across on TV as tools for rallying more people to their causes. These 2 decades were also a period of major shifts in the dynamics of the Cold War. Some major client states of the Soviets, like Egypt, switched sides. Nixon sought to strengthen communist China as a counterforce to the Soviets. The Soviets bolstered repressive dictators claiming to be democratic socialists, and the United States supported right-wing despots by backing coups d'etats in Latin America and arming tyrants who brutalized their own populations. Nobody really comes out of this looking good. India and apartheid South Africa became confirmed nuclear weapons powers, with Pakistan soon to follow, joining Israel as a relative newcomer to the nuclear weapons club and changing the high-stakes international political reality. In the West Bank and Gaza, as Israel's footprint in the occupied territories grew, so did its institutionalizing of various systems of control of the daily lives of Palestinians living there. Israel built checkpoints and roadblocks, set up separate systems of courts and identification documents for Palestinians living in the territories, and used these bureaucratic structures to stymie and prevent Palestinians from building new homes and schools. Palestinians living in Gaza and the West Bank could not vote for representatives in the Knesset, but they were required to seek permits to travel from point to point, whether to go to a job or a doctor's appointment in Jerusalem, visit a relative, or take a flight to another country. Israel also began hiring Palestinian informants, using embarrassing personal failings or financial crises in families to coerce and entice Palestinians in the territories to inform on their relatives and neighbors. And it implemented measures to incentivize Palestinians to emigrate away from the region permanently. With each new Israeli settlement, the Israeli government would use something like eminent domain to justify seizing Palestinian-owned lands for the roads, sewage lines, and other infrastructure needed to connect settlements to the rest of the Israeli grid, squeezing Palestinians in these areas into increasingly fragmented and smaller enclaves. Palestinian business ties with the rest of the Arab world and between the West Bank and Gaza became choked, and the economy there deteriorated. Unemployment skyrocketed, morale cratered, and a certain kind of new alienation grew between Palestinians living under occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, as opposed to the PLO's top officials, who were often seen on TV and who began to gain a reputation of growing affluent and detached from the increasingly bleak realities facing West Bank and Gazan Palestinians. Meanwhile, in other parts of the Islamic world, these 2 decades saw the rise to power of 2 major fundamentalist Islamic political movements. The Mujahideen, forerunners of the Taliban in Afghanistan, successfully overthrew their Soviet-backed communist regime and repelled Soviet invaders with the military and covert help of the United States. In Iran, a Shiite fundamentalist movement that helped overthrow a Western puppet tyrant, the Shah of Iran, then seized power over the country and implemented its own repressive theocracy. And finally, one last major theme worth keeping in mind, if your brain isn't already overflowing with too much information. The 70s and the 80s were the decades in which 2 major internationally organized protest movements reached their peak strength and intensity. The movement to free 3 million Soviet Jews from what was now more than half a century of intense Soviet repression was now impacting US-Soviet relations. And activists around the world began to win battles to get their governments to boycott, divest from, and place sanctions upon the racist South African government. Both of these liberation movements would have big impacts on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And let's keep in mind, as we think about these 2 decades, that the #1 communication technology during this time is not the internet or social media, not yet. It's television. So let's immerse ourselves ever further in the 70s and 80s. For a little personal context, these were the years that I spent big parts of my summers as a child and then a teenager visiting my Moroccan Israeli working class relatives in Tel Aviv. That's me with hair at age 16. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack, including bombing runs that at first looked like might result in total victory. Israel was ultimately able to rally and push back the invading forces to the same ceasefire lines that had been in place after the '67 war, but at a very high cost in terms of casualties. Israelis' sense of euphoria and even military invincibility was shattered, while Arab pride swelled with what was perceived as a well-organized, devastating military setback to Israel. By 1973, President Nasser of Egypt had been dead 3 years. He had died suddenly of a heart attack, and Anwar Sadat had become president. Prior to launching the '73 attack, Sadat began the process of switching Egypt from the Soviet side to the American side in the Cold War. Having shown himself to be formidable, both militarily and diplomatically, Sadat then initiated and concluded with hardline Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty. The treaty resulted in Israel returning the Sinai to Egypt, establishing a model that would come to be known as Land for Peace. One of the other lessons many of Israel's foes drew from Sadat's combination of moves vis-a-vis Israel was that it might not be possible to defeat Israel straight up on the battlefield, but that well-designed military attacks that seriously wounded Israel would probably ultimately lead to Israel making land concessions further down the road. A third piece of conventional wisdom that many Israelis drew from the peace deal with Egypt focused on Israel's leader at the time, the former Irgun guerrilla commander who was considered to be a rabid hawk, Menachem Begin. From 1977 on, you would come to hear countless Israeli pundits say that you only make peace from strength. Only our most aggressive leaders are the ones who will make peace with the Arabs. You will see. I'm not saying these various takeaways are correct. I'm just noting that they exist in people's minds. So, in sum, Sadat's strategies seem to achieve the goals he had sought to achieve. His surprise attack in '73 forced Prime Minister Golda Meir to resign in disgrace, which paved the way for Begin to become Israel's first prime minister from a party other than Labor, and then led to a Land for Peace agreement in which Egypt realigned from the Soviets to the Americans and got back the Sinai Desert. Now let's talk about settlements a bit. Starting in 1968, successive Israeli governments pursued a policy of incentivizing Israeli Jewish citizens to move into a number of planned settlements dotting the West Bank and Gaza. While a minority of settlers were motivated by the new religious messianist movement that asserted that God wanted the Jews to settle all of the biblical lands of Israel, and that the Six-Day War was won through divine miracles, most settlers were attracted to sweetheart deals for housing and other generous benefits they received in exchange for being the government's eyes and ears on the ground amongst the Arabs. Initially, the number of settlers was in the few thousands, but in time it has increased to over 700,000 settlers living in the West Bank today. And what began as a radical outlier religious nationalist movement in 1968 has today become the dominant religious belief system of orthodoxy in the pro-settler community, deeply immersed in the belief that it is a grave sin for a Jew to give up even 1 millimeter of what was biblical Israel, and that even if the Israeli army itself should try to remove settlements as part of a peace agreement, the duty of settlers will then be to fight the Israeli army. Let's move now into a Jewish narrative as it relates to this period. You've just endured a lengthy background mini lecture, and I applaud you for hanging in there. And don't worry if you didn't track every little last bit of it. It is actually useful that there's a recording. The broad themes were what is most important. So From an Israeli perspective, the period from 1968 to 1987 was marked by a relentless series of terrorist attacks by multiple Palestinian factions, working at times in partnership with other left-wing radical groups with a number of different agendas. Israelis became intensely security conscious and relied heavily on the bulk of their civilian-based army and their intelligence secret service to thwart terrorist plots whenever possible and to retaliate when attacks succeeded in killing Israelis. Israelis relied on their ironclad determination. Sorry, I think I got misaligned here for a quick second. No, maybe not. Israelis relied on their ironclad determination, homegrown intelligence and technical skills, and wide-scale civilian cooperation to outfox the constant onslaught of attacks against Israelis and against Western targets hated for supporting Israel, and sometimes against Jews, regardless of whether or not they were Israelis. This was an era in which Israelis perceived themselves to be the underdogs of the region, the David to a Goliath, comprised of 22 Arab states, a well-funded Palestinian network of militias determined to wipe them off the map, a Soviet propaganda machine that was now firmly invested in portraying Zionism as an international conspiracy and a social evil. A period in which, from an Israeli point of view, international diplomatic elites found it fashionable to condemn Israel at the drop of a hat, and a period in which rising radical Islamist movements were gaining strength. Complaints about settlements were met by a lot of Israelis with the rationale that these were temporary outposts useful for maintaining security, and that the religious zealots growing in the midst of the settlements would never amount to more than a fringe movement. Perhaps this whole period in the classic Zionist narrative can best be captured by the daring Israeli raid on Entebbe Airport in Uganda, freeing dozens of Jewish hostages from a protracted nightmare and giving Israelis a sense of their own remarkable capacity to find a way to triumph even against uncompromising terrorists. As someone who grew up in the 70s and 80s, this was the Israeli narrative that I absorbed. And I want to mention that right here, these images on the slides don't correspond perfectly to the narrative. So I'm going to pop out for a second and just mention a couple of things that jump out and are important for understanding things that loomed large in the Jewish narrative in the 70s and 80s. And I'm going to point to actually the middle figure in the left, the man wearing the suit and a necktie with the United Nations emblem behind him. That is Kurt Waldheim, who was at the time Secretary General of the United Nations, and as folks learned some years later, had been an SS officer during World War II. He had sort of hidden that part of his resume when he went on to, later a later diplomatic career. When the famous UN resolution proclaiming that Zionism is a form of racism passed, it passed, by the way, at the instigation of and intense organizing of the Soviet Union. It was a part of an intense campaign that the Soviet Union waged, depicting Zionism as an international conspiracy whose goals were much greater than securing the state of Israel. They were actually attempting to destroy the Soviet Union itself. That was what the Soviets were cranking out there for years and years. So they pushed for this resolution. they managed to get it passed. And for Israelis, having this Austrian diplomat, only 3 decades out from the end of the Holocaust, and then someone who we later found out was an SS officer, having him preside over the UN session where Zionism was proclaimed to be racism, that just kind of is emblematic of how strong the feeling in the Jewish narrative throughout this period was of Israel still really being David and forces aligned against Israel being Goliath. Even though Israel had won the war in 67 and captured territory and was becoming a serious military power. So it's important to understand how these things were held and felt in the minds and in the consciousness of a Jewish narrative at the time. I'm going to use another specific example to highlight the contrast between the Israeli and the Palestinian narratives during this period. And I'll just say, this is a terrible incident I'm about to describe. On March 11th, 1978, Palestinian guerrillas, including the woman featured in the red poster, Dalal Mughrabi, snuck into Israel from a Palestinian base in Lebanon and hijacked a passenger bus. They killed 35 civilians, 13 of them children, and they wounded 71 more people before Israeli forces finally stopped them. For Israelis, this was the face of Palestinian resistance. Ruthless, heartless, even monstrous. And sure enough, the terrorists who carried out this massacre were publicly revered by many Palestinian leaders and their allies as martyrs and heroes of the revolution to overcome the scourge of Zionism. I'll leave this painful moment now to sit just as it is. We're going to come back to it in a short while, but it's telling that if you're living in the shoes of Israelis and of folks in the Jewish community who would have spent a couple weeks being shaken by the Coastal Road massacre and would have known what that event referred to, then if you understand that that was an experience that typified much of what Israelis and Jews who cared about Israel saw and witnessed during this period, then you can better understand what it would be like to walk in their shoes. Now we're going to flip the narrative. For Palestinians, the 70s and the 80s are a time of Israelis intensifying and entrenching the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. Land confiscations for settlements, the diversion of resources like water from the aquifer beneath the West Bank for Israeli use, the restrictions on Palestinian freedom of movement, the infiltration of surveillance, combined with increasing economic isolation, all served to raise the temperature of what was becoming a pressure cooker. Israeli soldiers, using military rule, would arrest Palestinians without formal charges. They detained minors and adults at will, and a growing body of evidence even acknowledged by Israeli authorities that Israeli authorities engaged in torture with some of their prisoners. When Palestinians struck back and killed any Israelis, Israel would respond by bombing Palestinian refugee camps with, from a Palestinian perspective, callousness and ruthlessness, killing astounding numbers of civilians seemingly without a care. From a Palestinian narrative perspective, this is state terrorism. A Palestinian culture of resilience, endurance, and martyrdom found expression both underground and through encoded displays of national pride. These were decades of Egypt's great betrayal of the Palestinian cause, having sold them out in order to get the Sinai back, and Sadat having sold out the Palestinians also to cozy up to his new sugar daddy, the United States. Meanwhile, the Israeli government implemented an array of Kafkaesque bureaucratic nightmares for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, along with numerous quiet incentives to get more and more Palestinians to just leave the region. The Palestinians in the occupied territories and in the refugee camps of neighboring countries were in an intensifying pressure cooker. 1970 brought the first of a series of explosions of that pressure cooker. At that time, the PLO was headquartered in Jordan. Jordan's Hashemite-run government became fearful of the PLO and other Palestinian resistance groups that were gaining strength on their soil. And Palestinians were fearful that Jordan's King Hussein, whose heart never seemed to be entirely in joining the other Arab nations to fight the Israelis in previous wars, well, they were worried that King Hussein would eventually sell them out to the Israelis in the West. King Hussein survived multiple assassination attempts. Tensions finally came to a head when the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, a Marxist-Leninist organization that was the second largest of the political groups under the umbrella of the PLO, hijacked 4 Western airliners on the same day. One of the planes landed in London after the crew overcame the hijackers, but the other 3 planes were brought to an airfield in Jordan. The crew and passengers were relocated to a hotel, and then the PFLP blew up the 3 planes on live international TV. King Hussein then ordered Jordanian forces to drive the PLO, including tens of thousands of civilian refugees, out of Jordan in one of the bloodiest of all violent sweeps by an armed force against the Palestinians. Chased from one foreign land to the next, Lebanon became the hub of the PLO and other Palestinian liberation groups' efforts to prepare themselves for battle to regain their homes and lands, should the opportunity present itself. Men, women, and youth volunteered to undergo rigorous military training in these camps, often carrying with them nightmares born not only of Israeli forced expulsions, but also at the hands of Jordanian and eventually Lebanese military forces. Israeli airstrikes would sometimes level whole sections of Palestinian refugee camps, compounding trauma upon trauma. Indeed, the Israelis ultimately chased the PLO out of Lebanon, leaving a wake of massive civilian casualties as they did. And then the Israelis continued their attacks on the PLO in Tunisia after the organization had relocated there. Finally, Palestinians in the West Bank could take it no more. In 1987, spontaneous protests, general strikes, public displays of the Palestinian flag, which was outlawed by Israel, and mass demonstrations against Israeli military rule boiled over into what would become called the First Intifada. Kids who fought with slingshots became known as the Children of the Stones, and for many Westerners, for the first time, they saw images that aligned with how Palestinians long understood themselves as the real David versus Israel, the Goliath. The Israeli army responded initially with harsher and harsher force, arresting thousands, engaging in public beatings and shootings, and escalating their rhetoric of their determination to crush and subjugate Palestinians. The Intifada seemed to ignite a spirit of change, not only among Palestinians living under Israeli occupation, but also among the PLO's leadership in Tunis. Perhaps following the conventional wisdom that began with Sadat's combination of striking an effective military blow against the Israelis, followed by making a diplomatic overture, in 1988, the PLO, headed by Arafat, proclaimed that its political goal was the establishment of a Palestinian state alongside Israel, and that while it did not give up the right of Palestinians to return to their properties wherever they may be, it was prepared to accept a two-state agreement with Israel. The Israelis, in a move that in hindsight can only be described as one of the world's greatest acts of short-sightedness, countered the PLO's new posture by covertly aiding and encouraging the Muslim Brotherhood-affiliated Hamas in Gaza as a political rival to the PLO. Hamas at the time was a religious and social service-oriented movement, political for sure, and ideologically and religiously committed to the total defeat of Israel and the installation of an Islamic religious regime in all of the land. But in practical terms, at this time, Hamas did not have that much hard power. Hamas was outraged by the PLO's 1988 declaration that they were willing to accept a two-state agreement with Israel. They were outraged by the PLO's concessions to Israel in this public statement. This had the advantage of firing up a lot of the people who already supported Hamas in Gaza. Why did they support Hamas? Because Hamas was not corrupt. They were very good at helping ordinary Gazans solve problems through their social service network. Hamas, meanwhile, amped up its criticism of the PLO for being corrupt and criticized the wealthy lifestyles led by Arafat and his entire entourage of officials. Let's leave this subject where it is for the moment in order to focus on another part of the Palestinian narrative that is often unfamiliar to the Jewish community. In the 1970s and 80s, Israel and apartheid South Africa were allies. They engaged in trade, they shared military intelligence, and they even did joint military exercises. Palestinians were well aware of this, and for them, it helped make it obvious that what Israel was seeking to do with them was their own version of apartheid. When defenders of Israel get offended and shocked at accusations of Israel being guilty of apartheid, a lot of Palestinians roll their eyes. From their perspective, the connection is not only obvious, but it is grounded in Israel's history. We're about to exit this dual narrative portion of the course, and I want to come back to this horrible moment that I said I would. While the actions of Dalal Mughrabi and her cohorts who carried out what became known to Israelis as the coastal road narrative feature firmly in the Israeli narrative, what grabs center stage in the Palestinian narrative is not what Mughrabi did, but what the Israelis did 3 days later. The Israelis, in response to the coastal road massacre, invaded Lebanon by ground and by air. They dropped cluster bombs, one of the most brutal weapons designed to cause civilian casualties, and they killed about 2,000 civilians. men, women, children, babies. In this attack, the Israelis caused 250,000 Lebanese civilians to be displaced. Just as in the Zionist narrative, many people would ask, what kind of monstrous people would honor terrorists who killed 13 children on a bus in Israel? In the Palestinian narrative, people ask, what kind of nation, what kind of moral army kills on so grand a scale, treats Arab civilian life as worth so much less than their own people's lives? This is the question that dominates Palestinian stories in the aftermath of this particular round of fighting. And if all this feels really familiar to current events, that's because it is. This cycle keeps repeating itself. Okay, the last part of the lecture is ending on a hopeful note, or we'll see. In 1992, Israelis voted to return power to a center-left government led by Yitzhak Rabin, who campaigned on a platform of reviving peace talks with the Palestinians. The following year brought a moment of exhilaration and great hope to much of the Jewish and Palestinian communities. The signing of the Oslo Accords held out the promise of ending the indignities of the 25-year-old occupation. The agreement, signed by the government of Israel and the PLO, marked the formal recognition of each by the other as the legitimate representative of their respective peoples, which was in and of itself a huge diplomatic achievement. The agreement went further. It was designed to create incremental and tangible trust building between Israel and the newly formed government entity called the Palestinian Authority, the PA. And even though it is not explicitly stated in the Oslo Accord that the end game of all this was going to be a two-state solution, it was clearly understood by both parties that that was what the Oslo Accords were aiming at. Over the next 5 years, both parties committed to implement staged handovers of territories in the West Bank and Gaza to the PA, while simultaneously negotiating the form of a final status agreement by the end of 1998. Now, lots of people today are really cynical about the Oslo Accords, but they actually got off to a really impressive start. The PLO made a dramatic homecoming and was allowed to take over Gaza and the West Bank city of Jericho in the first stage of implementation. Arafat was named president of the PA, and the central staff of the PLO moved into their first headquarters in Gaza. Dramatic changes happened fast. The Israeli army left Gaza and Jericho. Gone were the daily patrols by Israeli soldiers, the checkpoints, the prohibition on publicly displaying the Palestinian flag. Money started flowing into the region for new infrastructure projects. The Mossad began working directly with the PLO's intelligence agency to thwart terrorist attacks aimed at derailing the progress of the peace process. A Palestinian police force with uniforms and guns that looked more like, and in many ways was, an army, began joint patrols with the Israeli Defense Force units, with soldiers from both sides riding in the very same jeeps. The Oslo Accords were based on the idea of incremental trust building, creating momentum ahead of the toughest decisions that both sides would have to sell to their own people towards the end of the 5-year period. For the first 2 to 3 years, it began to look like the people who designed this plan might be political geniuses. Instead of just that little blotch where it says Jericho, if you can see it kind of on the right side of the slide, instead of just that little blotch where it says Jericho and then the Gaza Strip coming under full Palestinian control under the PA, within about a year of the start of the agreement, all the other little brown blotches that you can see also transferred to control under the Palestinian Authority. Then the gold yellow areas, those splotches that you can see in the West Bank, known as Area B, they start to come online. And in those areas, the Palestinian Authority gets administrative control over civil matters, and the Israeli military is still in charge of security. But what you're seeing happening is this staged expansion of Israeli forces handing over total authority to a growing set of areas, the brown splotches that were growing larger and popping up in more places, and then handing over many kinds of authority while still maintaining a security role in all those gold splotches. And in these early days of implementing this agreement, it seemed like the splotches were going to keep growing until you had just about all of the West Bank and Gaza, and then a couple little bits were going to get negotiated about between the two sides, and they might even swap some land to make it all even Steven. But it felt like these splotches were growing. Today, when we look at maps of this like this, it's a lament because you're like, oh, it's a Swiss cheese and there's too many settlements surrounding splotches, and how's this going to become a state? But in 1994 and 95, these splotches were reason for optimism. That's what I'm trying to say. And I'll also say, in the areas where the Palestinian Authority took over with civilian control and the Israelis still had security control, remember, what are people seeing? A lot of what they're seeing is joint patrols with 2 Israeli and 2 Palestinian soldiers in the same vehicle. So all of that is tremendously rapid and tangible change. The first 3 years of Oslo were marred by some horrific acts of violence by extremists on both sides. This was the period when Baruch Goldstein murdered all those Muslim worshippers in the mosque near the Cave of the Patriarchs, for example. There were acts of terror committed by both sides trying to blow up the peace process. But the peace process was not derailed by these various crises. I want to focus, to close out today's lecture portion, on what was working with the Oslo Accords. We're going to talk about what went wrong next time. I just want to say, despite the horrible incidents and crises that came up and threatened to knock the whole thing apart, a lot of people at every level on both sides, political and diplomatic and person to person on the ground, really worked hard to not let the enemies of the process completely destroy it and to keep advancing these interim stages.
Rabbi Maurice, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second so I can alert people to A, open the chat, and
Great.
B, allow people to begin to formulate questions you might answer in the chat.
Great, and I've only got 2 more slides left, so.
It's been done.
Good.
So chat is open. That's the place to put your questions. Thanks.
Great. So, and I want to say that during this time, these first 2.5, 3 years of Oslo, I can't stress enough how tangible a lot of the changes, the positive changes were for people on both sides. Tangible changes make a really big difference if you're trying to get a new, risky peace agreement between 2 historical enemies to take hold. So on this slide, if you look at the lower left, what you're looking at is a picture of Gaza around 1995. Gaza was still at that time a train wreck of high poverty, unemployment, and crowdedness. But nevertheless, Gazans exulted in the end of the Israeli army's presence in the many streets and alleys and on rooftops of block after block after block where they lived. They reveled in the beginnings of self-rule, in the infusion of investments, including support for small businesses, restaurants. Restaurants proliferated along the beaches of Gaza, which are beautiful beaches. Israelis came in droves to eat at them. There's an economic boomlet that happens, and there's a great deal of optimism. For Israelis, tangible benefits. Very quickly, on the heels of Oslo, the Jordanians come on board and sign a new peace agreement with Israel. Amazing for Israelis. If you weren't there at the time, you wouldn't realize how euphoric Israelis were about this peace treaty with Jordan being an external benefit of the risks they were taking to do the Oslo agreement with the Palestinians. Think about it. With peace with Jordan, suddenly it's no longer true for Israelis to say, hey, we're surrounded by enemies. Not anymore. Now the whole border with Egypt and the whole border with Jordan are friends, or at least not enemies. At least they're open borders. You can cross over, you can visit, and they can come and visit here. Those were astonishing experiences that made people giddy. You can see more of the overall gestalt of what I'm talking about. The photo in the upper left is an example of a mixed Israeli and Palestinian patrol force. In the upper right, the Nobel Prize gets awarded. You know, all of this kind of has the feel at a certain point in 1995-ish, has the feel of a plan that's succeeding. In fact, here's something horribly ironic that I remember from my personal life. I remember in late 1994 when the US government sent the envoy, George Mitchell. They sent him to Northern Ireland to try to get the effort towards a peace agreement there out of a really bad place. It had been kind of going okay, and then there were a series of acts of terrorism on both sides that threatened the fragile negotiations in Northern Ireland. And members from both sides of that conflict were on an interview, and I happened to be watching TV and I saw this interview happening, and I saw one of them say to the journalist who asked, you know, do you ever lose hope of achieving an agreement? And he looked right into the camera and said, you know, if the Israelis and the Palestinians can do it, how is it that we cannot? It's bound to happen for us too. So that was that moment. Unfortunately, within a very short time, we see the beginnings of what pivots into a 2-decade-long collapse of the promise of the Oslo Agreement. And we're going to delve into that next time. But I'll offer one small sneak preview on the final slide. There were 2 core commitments to the Oslo process that neither side was willing to keep. The Israelis made a commitment, and I see I'm doing the bottom one first on the slide, sorry about that. The Israelis made a commitment to stop increasing building new settlements and increasing the footprint of existing settlements. The language next to where it says settlements on your screen is the part of the agreement that the parties all understood was referring specifically to settlement expansion. The Palestinian Authority committed to root out and stop the use of public airways they now controlled, and government-sponsored media outlets they now controlled, the use of those things for overt incitement to violence against Israelis and Jews, and for disseminating classically anti-Semitic content. Unfortunately, there was a fair amount of content like that that was coming out on Palestinian TV and radio, out of places governed by the Palestinian Authority. So what would happen? Well, the Israelis would complain to the Palestinians and the Americans that the Palestinians were not keeping their commitment to stop this incitement and hostile propaganda. And the Palestinians and Arafat would say, we're working on it. It's harder than it sounds. It's difficult to actually root this all out. And the Americans would say, that doesn't sound like a very difficult thing to root out. And the Palestinians would say, no, it is. But we're working on it. And the Israelis would fume. And the flip side of this also was happening. The Israelis, government after government, Labor and Likud, kept adding on to existing settlements and building new ones. And the Palestinians would complain to the Israelis and the Americans. And the Americans would complain to the Israelis as well. And both of them would say, we all know that you agreed to knock this off. And the Israelis would say, no, you don't understand. At first they would say, we're not building new settlements. We're finishing projects that got started before we made the agreement. And, come on, there's people who signed rents and mortgages and people are going to lose money. And don't worry about it. We're gonna work it all out by the end of the agreement. You're really being way oversensitive about this. Oh, by the way, the Palestinian Authority would say the same thing about the incitement. Oh, you're being way oversensitive about this. These are just some kooky people with some crazy ideas, and nobody listens to them anyway. And it's kind of performative. You don't understand our culture. People say over the top things. And the Israelis are like, I don't know. It sounded like you were saying you hate us and you want to kill us. Similar kind of thing here. Like Palestinians are like, I don't know. We thought we understood each other when we signed this thing, and you weren't going to do anything to change the status on the ground in these territories, but you're doing it anyway. And it's kind of making it hard for us to believe you about anything. And the Israelis would just keep saying, you're being far too worried about it. And sometimes they would say, we promise it's just this one more. And then there would be a new election and a new government would come in and start doing more. Point being, neither side was willing to actually make sure that these two specific commitments were kept. And my understanding is that this is one of the big reasons that caused Oslo not to achieve its goals. But we will delve further into that next time. And now I'm going to stop my screen share and rejoin you all. Thanks for listening and being present tonight.
I'm taking a moment to sort through the comments in the chat and see if we can derive a couple of questions we'd like to conclude in just the next few minutes, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes at the most. So give me a moment to find the best questions I can pull from the material that we have.
Sure thing.
I'm going to throw out a question that was asked by Vivian Topp. Where are the Palestinians living today, and are they mostly in refugee camps and indeed in tents?
Great question. So I don't actually know what fraction of Palestinians are living in refugee camps, but it wouldn't be hard for me to get that info. I'll see if I can get that info by next time. No, for my understanding is that I don't think any of the refugee camps today are made up of tents. I mean, there may be
Can you please mute the who's talking? Someone is talking. Can they be muted while the rabbi talks? Thank
another
you.
big issue that. Oh, thanks. Um, uh, my understanding is that refugee camps long ago took the form of cinder block apartments, kind of quickly thrown together and very crowded. I mean, I've been to a couple, and the ones that I've visited, which were in the West Bank, that's what they're like. I mean, they're basically sort of depressing slums, but I mean, people. There's the places that I visited were crowded and built quickly out of cheap materials. And there weren't like green spaces for kids to play, but they were not dirty. And what I can tell you is there's something on the order of 4 or 5 million Palestinian refugees who live scattered throughout different parts of the Arab world and in Europe and in the Americas. I mean, there really is at this point a pretty large and in many ways economically vibrant Palestinian diaspora. There's been like 3 to 4 generations of Palestinians who have taken advantage of scholarships, often funded by Arab states or by foundations in the Muslim world, and some of it coming from the West as well. But in Palestinian culture, education is valued very, very highly, and so there is a large and visible cohort of highly skilled, professionally trained Palestinians working in the oil industry throughout the Gulf world as technicians and engineers and lawyers. And there's an overabundance of Palestinian physicians who also can be found in disproportionate numbers to the Palestinian population in the United States in hospitals. There's like a tale of several different layers of Palestinian society. And this was also true before Zionism came along, right? There were urban folk, there were shopkeepers, there were wealthy landowners, there were peasants, there were Christians, there were Muslims, there were secular people, there were super devout people. And there were people involved in trade and doing very well in various kinds of international trade. And there were universities. And some of the universities, were founded by whichever empire came along and took over, right? So, during the long stretch of time that Islam controlled the territory and started creating early universities, they started institutions. When the Turks were there, they built some. When the Christians were there, all kinds of different Christian groups. They may not have been thinking about Palestinians per se. They were just thinking, we want to build a school and a hospital in the Holy Land. So there's all these institutions scattered throughout Israel and Gaza and the West Bank that have very old histories and deep endowments. And a complex portrait of who Palestinians are and where they live would reveal, it would run the gamut from wealth to poverty, from luxury to despair.
Thank you. I want to try to pull a question from the chat. If I'm getting this right, uh, do the generations of Palestinians, now perhaps even the great grandchildren of those who were original refugees, still claim an interest in uh, land that we think of as Israel proper, not as the occupied territories. And how would the Oslo Accords have dealt with those issues?
So, the way to unsophisticated short answer that I've learned from Palestinian teachers about this stuff, including historians who, are also trying to distance themselves from their own people's narrative. The short answer is yes. That it's kind of a cardinal principle of Palestinian identity and culture, to teach the idea that this is your right, and that it is something sacred. Now, that's not exactly the same thing as what decision would you make if faced with a convincing offer to end this conflict. And so Oslo anticipated that the issue of persuading the great majority of descendants of people who lost homes in 48 to forego their right to return to the specific homes and places where they were, or if those places weren't accessible anymore, to, I don't know, be given a piece of land inside Israel proper. That the PLO, in going into the Oslo Agreement, understood full well that if it was going to succeed, there was going to be an end game, and it was going to involve them having to sell their own people on this particular sacrifice, that at most maybe a quarter of Palestinians who would have such a claim and have some evidence to back that claim up would potentially be moving to Israel proper. And that's probably like the highest possible number that at that time I could have even imagined an Israeli government contemplating. And one of the hopes that the people who designed the process held was that if you could have enough goodwill get generated during the first 4 years, that in year 5, when the toughest compromises were going to have to be made, that you'd be at your highest psychological probability of decent majorities on both sides being willing to make those sacrifices, because you've had 4 years now of seeing your life get so much better. And that's a different place to make a decision about whether to, if it comes down to, do we quit making all this progress and go back to the way it was before, because we feel that it's unjust for us to give this up? Or could we come around to a place where our own leaders are asking us to use the phrase Arafat liked to use, the peace of the brave? And that I had a feeling he was using that phrase a lot, in part because that was going to be some of the language that might get used to try to sell the hardest parts to rank and file Palestinians. And the flip is true for Israeli leaders. There were going to be parts of this that were going to require enormous political talent to sell to Israelis. In particular, the idea of sharing sovereignty over any part of Jerusalem just felt like touching the third rail to Israeli politicians, and yet they knew there was no final agreement that could work for both sides that didn't include some symbolic, at least, piece of East Jerusalem where where the capital of Palestine would be, and their flag would be there. So, yeah, I mean, but it is very much a deep, deep part of the Palestinian narrative, this idea that your great-grandparents' shops and farms, that's your legacy and your inheritance, and that's your right. You could choose to do a lot of things, but you can't just dismiss the importance of that right in that culture.
Thank you, Rabbi. One question I see that struck me as interesting was we heard that the Palestinians had encamped in Jordan for many years until the Jordan Black September, and also in Lebanon. One questioner wonders why the Palestinians were not more able to assimilate into those host countries, even perhaps Tunisia.
Well, so this is interesting. There was not a whole group of civilians that accompanied the flight of the PLO and all of its bureaucrats and to Tunisia. That was really just literally the government in exile. In Jordan and in southern Lebanon, you had these large sets of refugee camps that were there. So even when Jordan pushed the PLO out, it is true that the Jordanian forces killed a huge number of Palestinian civilians. I mean, some say 10,000, possibly, maybe more. And were accused subsequently of war crimes and atrocities. But it's not like, 300,000 or 400,000 Palestinian refugees then migrated from Jordan to Lebanon. Most of the bulk of those refugees remained in Jordan. And let me answer the question. So what Jordan's leaders do after they drive the PLO out is then they make the decision that they are going to extend full citizenship to Palestinians living in refugee camps in Jordan. So they're the only Arab state that did that. And today, 65% of the citizens of the state of Jordan are Palestinian by descent. And they are ruled by a constitutional monarchy that privileges the Hashemite line and ethnic group that surrounds, that is led by the king. And they're in a state that was completely made up by Britain. So, the answer to part of the question is, well, that did happen in one place, and it was a big risk that the Jordanian government took. And it's, in terms of stability, it's largely worked. Lebanon, I think I've already talked about. The reason that the Lebanese government hasn't created the opportunity for Palestinian refugees there to integrate into Lebanese society is that it would completely undo all the careful work that had been done to put Lebanon together and make it function in the first place. It's just been an unresolvable difficulty. In other parts of the Arab world, particularly in the Gulf states, what you see is there are a lot of Palestinians who are there on extended work permits, and they're there at different levels. They're there, some of them are there on the crummy way to be in the Gulf states, which is under the kafala system, which is basically a legalized work permit system for people from other parts of the world to come and be poor and be treated like crud. So there's a chunk of Palestinians who are there doing menial labor and just sending money back home as best they can. And then there's a group of highly educated professional class Palestinians in those countries. And again, I don't think they are offered citizenship in those countries, but I also think as a point of pride that they don't want it. But they are offered work permits and, long-term residency. So I guess what I would say is this idea, this question that comes up a lot, I think out of the Zionist narrative, it's this question of why can't the Arabs treat their brethren decently as we Jews always try to do ours? And I really want to urge folks to question the legitimacy of that question. I don't think it's correct to say, oh, well, look at the Arabs. They just leave them languishing in ruins, and they don't really care about them, but they pretend to. That's not really what's happened. What's happened, and by the way, Arab governments have invested billions of dollars into refugee camps and in scholarships and medical support, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there are these specific situations, like in Lebanon, where there are refugee camps, where it's this politically impossible situation. And every time somebody, shakes it a little bit, the country falls apart into civil war. So yeah, I guess that's what I would have to say about that.
Thank you, Rabbi. I think we've come to the end and we need to conclude, even though there are many more questions. Perhaps you can look at them and think about some things we might address in the future. But we're out of time tonight, so we want to thank you. I also want to remind people, as respectfully as possible, that please use the chat with respect for your neighbors and those who are offering opinions. Even if we disagree with each other, and Lord knows we all have strong opinions on these issues, it's really important that we maintain our good relationships here and try to speak to each other with respect and integrity. So I thank you all for